So this video is going to cover 3 areas. First of all, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the power of listening and why I think it's really important and critical to our coaching relationships. Then we're going to go into specifically the role that listening actually plays in our coaching relationships to understand that more. And then finally, we're going to explore how do we practice active listening? How do we actually go about cultivating that as a skill? First of all, I just want to talk about the power of listening and why it's a topic that I'm so passionate about. We're living in this digital world where we're highly distracted. It's all about consuming as much information as we can rather than paying attention, being present. 1 hour after a conversation with someone, we only remember 25% of what they've actually shared with us. For me, that statistic had a massive impact, along with the additional one that 75% of the time we're either disinterested, preoccupied or distracted. So I think that really speaks to why active listening is something that we need to try and cultivate within our coaching. Fran Lebowitz says that the opposite of speaking is not listening, it's waiting to speak, and that really struck a chord with me. And when I think about listening, I think about the different qualities of someone who's a really great listener: curious, interested, you feel like they're really present and attentive to what you're sharing with them. And I think that those qualities are really transformational, and that's why they're fundamental to a coaching relationship. I would actually argue that listening is the most fundamental skill that we have in our coaching practice. It's very easy to think that you're going to come in and you're going to create some transformation for your client. You're going to kind of diagnose what their challenge is towards getting towards their goal, and you're going to help them understand it. But it's a collaborative process, and listening and the ability to be able to skillfully play back to your client what you've heard, check your understanding, be aware of your biases and your projections in that listening process are really, really critical. And what I'd say about active listening, it's obviously something that's used within coaching, counselling, facilitation, a number of different sort of environments, but it's very, very different from your everyday conversation. As we know, coaching is a different kind of conversation, so you really need to prepare for that conversation in order to make it feel successful. And often it looks very effortless and feels very effortless when you're on the receiving end, but preparation is really key. Active listening really has 3 steps that kind of go with it. It's setting your environment, checking that you're in the right sort of headspace and you've prepared yourself for the conversation, and then really proactively thinking about checking the understanding that you've had with your client by asking questions, recapping and playing back. Setting the environment, first of all, I think it's making sure that you're in an environment where both you and the coachee feel comfortable. There are minimal distractions there for either of you. You're able to really focus fully on that individual and the conversation at hand. Secondly, preparing yourself. Now, this is something that I don't take for granted, even after all the years of coaching. I try to be really intentional about going into a coaching conversation, thinking about what it is I need to do to ground myself. So I've got a bit of a checklist: sit down, feel my feet firmly on the ground, tune into my breath a little bit before I start a coaching session, mentally prepare myself for that conversation and be really aware of the relationship I've got with that individual, anything I'm bringing to the conversation, so that I can just be mindful of that before the conversation progresses. Starting off with curiosity and interest. If we can cultivate these ideas of curiosity and interest, then that enables us to be present and engage in that conversation in a really meaningful way. Also, the ability to have a bit of a parallel process of what's going on for us, checking our own biases, projections, and not making assumptions. One of the temptations that we can have is to want to bring our own ideas in rather than to actively listen. That's definitely something to be aware of. We can go into a conversation with all the right intentions, but we do bring our own sort of biases into a conversation. We might have a bright idea that we want to share. We want to demonstrate the value that we're bringing to the conversation. There's something about not being afraid of silences within a conversation, because often having that moment of pause, even to the point where it might be a little bit uncomfortable for both parties, is where the breakthrough in the conversation actually happens. So some final tips on active listening: being intentional and committed to really engaging in that active listening process with curiosity and openness, setting up the right environment for that kind of conversation to happen. And then finally, remembering that active listening is not purely an intellectual process, it is an emotional process as well. And it's about listening beyond the words. So it's about listening to, yes, what has been said, what's not been said, but also about the body language, the pauses, and the way that you feel as a coach when you're actually hearing what's the impact that what's being shared with you has on you, and how you can appropriately share that back with your client.